Chapter 9. As if a benign harbinger, Patricia Weaver was at home. She opened the door at her connapt and said, "Oh goodness, so you're the man with my script. How early you are," you said on the vidphone. "I got finished earlier than I had expected." Chuck entered her apt, glancing at the excessively modern furniture. It was neo-pre-Columbian in style, based on recent archaeological discoveries of the Incan culture in South America. All the furniture, of course, was hand-wrought, and on the walls hung the new animated action paintings that never ceased moving. They consisted of two-dimensional machines that clattered away softly, like the rush of a distant ocean, or he thought more practically, like a subsurface autofac. He was not certain he liked them. "You've got it with you," Miss Weaver said delightedly. She wore, and this seemed odd for so early in the evening, a high-fashion Paris dress, the like of which he had witnessed in magazines, but never before in actual life. This was a long way from his desk at CIA. The dress was lavish and complex, like the petals of a non-tea flower. It must have cost 1,000 skins, Chuck decided. This was a dress in which to get a job. Her right breast, firm and up-tilted, was totally exposed. It was a very fashionable dress indeed. Had she been expecting someone else, Bunny Hintman, for example? "I was going out," Patty explained, "for a cocktail, but I'll call and cancel it." She walked to the vidphone, her sharp high heels clacking against the synthetic Inca-style dirt floor. "I hope you like the script," he said, wandering about and feeling small time. This was a bit over his head. The elaborate, expensive dress, the hand-wrought furnishings. He stood facing a painting, watched as its non-objective surfaces slid and altered, forming entirely new and never-to-be-repeated combinations. Patty returned from the vidphone. I was able to catch him before he left MGB Studios. She did not specify who, and Chuck decided not to ask. It would probably deflate him even further. A drink, she went to the sideboard, opened a pre-Columbian wood and gold cabinet, revealing bottle after bottle. "What about an Ionian Wuzzball? It's the snig. You must try it. I bet it hasn't got up into Northern California. You're so," she gestured, "so gas-headed up there." She began to mix drinks. "Can I help?" He came over beside her, feeling serious and protective, or at least wanting to be. "No thanks." Patty expertly handed him the glass. "Let me ask you something," she said, "even before I look at the script. Is my part large?" He said. He made it as large as he could. But the fact of the matter was this: her role was minor. The head of the fish got thrown to her, but the fillets had, of necessity, gone to Bunny. "You mean it's small," Patty said, walking to the bench, like couch, and seating herself. The petals of her dress spread out on each side of her. "Let me see it, please." She had now an astute and entirely professional air about her. She was absolutely calm. Seating himself across from her, Chuck handed her the pages of the script. It included what he had sent to Bunny, and the more recent portion, her part in particular, which Bunny had not yet seen. Perhaps this was improper, showing Patty her script before Bunny saw it, but he had decided to do it, mistake or not. "This other woman," Patty said shortly. It did not take her long to leaf through the pages. "The wife, the shrew that Ziggy decides to kill. She's got a much bigger part. She goes all the way through it, and I'm really only in this one scene. At his office, where she comes in, at the CIA headquarters." She pointed to the part. What Patty said was true. He had done his best, but that was it. A fact was a fact, and Patty was too wise, professionally, to be deceived. "I made it as big as I could," he said honestly. Patty said, "It's almost one of those awful parts where a girl is just brought in to stand and look sexy, and not really do anything. I don't just want to come in wearing a tight open-bodice dress and be an ornament. I'm an actress. I want lines." She handed him the script back. "Please," she said, "Mr. Rittersdorf, for Christ's sakes, build up my part. Bunny hasn't seen this, has he? This is still just between you and me, so maybe between us we can think up something. How about a restaurant scene? Ziggy is meeting the girl, Sharon, at this fancy little out-of-the-way restaurant, and the wife shows up. Ziggy has it out with her there, not at home in their Connaught. And then Sharon, my part, she can be involved in that scene too." He said. He sipped his drink. It was an odd, sweet concoction, much like mead. It occurred to him to wonder what it had in it. Across from him, Patty had already drunk hers. She now returned to the sideboard to fix herself another. He also rose, walked over to stand beside her. Against him, her small shoulder brushed, and he could smell the peculiar strange scent of the drink which she was making. One ingredient, he noticed, came from a distinctly non-tea bottle. The printing on it seemed Alphane. "It's from Alpha 1, Patty said. Bunny gave it to me. He got it from some Alfs he knows. Bunny knows every kind of creature in the inhabited universe. Did you know he lived for a while in the Alf system?" She raised her glass, turned to face him, and stood sipping meditatively. "I wish I could visit another star system. It must make you feel almost, superhuman." Setting his glass down, Chuck put his hands on Patty Weaver's slight, rather hard shoulders. The dress crinkled. "I can make your part somewhat larger," he said. "Okay," Patty said. She leaned against him, sighed as she rested her head on his shoulder. "It does mean a lot to me." She said. Her hair, long and auburn, brushed his face, tickling his nose. Taking her glass from her, he sipped, then set it down on the sideboard. The next he knew, they were in the bedroom. The drinks, he thought, mixing with the illegal GB40 thalamic stimulant that Lord, whatever his name is, gave me. The bedroom was nearly dark, but he could see, outlined beyond his right arm, Patty Weaver sitting on the edge of the bed, unhooking some intricate part of her dress. The dress came off at last, and Patty carried it carefully to the closet to hang it up. She returned, doing something strange with her breast. He watched her for a moment, and then he realized that she was massaging her rib cage. She had been bound up in the dress, and now she could relax, move about unhindered. Both breasts, he saw, were an ideal size, albeit for the most part synthetic. As she walked, they did not wobble in the slightest. The left, as well as the previously exposed right, was strikingly firm. As Patty dropped like a well-oiled stone into the bed next to the spot where he himself lay, the vidphone rang. Patty said, startling him. She slid from the bed, stood, groped for her robe. Finding it, she started barefoot from the room, tying its sash. "I'll be right back, dear," she said, matter-of-factly. "You just stay there." He lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the softness, smelling the fragrance of the bed. A long, long time seemed to pass. He felt very happy. This kind of waiting was a great, peaceful pleasure. And then suddenly there stood Patty Weaver in the bedroom doorway, in a robe, her hair down over her shoulders in a loose cloud. He waited, but she did not approach the bed. All at once he realized that she was not going to. She was coming no farther in. Instantly he sat up. His mood of supine relaxation dwindled, vanished. "Who was it?" he said. "Bunny." "So, the deal is off." She came in now, but to the closet. From it she took a simple skirt and blouse. Picking up her underclothing she departed, obviously to dress somewhere else. "Why is it off?" He hopped from the bed, began feverishly to dress. Patty had disappeared somewhere in the act. A door closed. She did not answer. Evidently she had not heard him. As he sat on the bed, fully dressed, tying his shoelaces, Patty reappeared. She too was fully dressed. She stood, brushing her hair, her face expressionless. She watched him fumble with his laces, making no comment. It was, he thought, as if she were a light year away. The bedroom was pervaded by her neutral coolness. "Tell me," he repeated, "why the deal is off. Tell me exactly what Bunny Hintman said." "Oh, he said he's not going to use your script, and if I called you, or if you called me, now for the first time since the vid call." Her eyes focused on him as if she were seeing him at last. "I didn't say you were here, but he said if I talked to you, I was to tell you that he's thought your idea over, and it isn't any good." "My idea?" "The whole script. He got the pages you expressed to him, and he thought they were terrible." Chuck felt his ears burn and freeze at once. The pain spread to his face like frost, numbing his lips and nose. "So," Patty said, "he's having Dark and Jones, his regular writers, do something entirely different." After a long time, Chuck said huskily, "Am I supposed to get in touch with him?" He didn't say. She had finished brushing her hair. Now she left the bedroom, again disappearing. Rising, he followed after her, finding her in the living room. She was at the vidphone, dialing. "Who are you calling?" he demanded. Patty said remotely, "Someone I know, to take me out to dinner." In a voice that cracked with chagrin, Chuck said, "Let me take you out to dinner. I'd love to." The girl did not even bother to answer. She continued to dial. Going over to the pre-Columbian bench, he began to gather up the pages of his script. He returned them to the envelope. Meanwhile, Patty had got her party. He heard in the background her low voice, muted. "I'll see you," Chuck said. He put on his coat, strode to the door of the act. She did not look up from the vidphone screen. She was absorbed. With anguished wrath, he slammed the door after him, hurried down the carpeted hall to the elevator. Twice he stumbled, and he thought, "God, the drink is still afflicting me. Maybe the whole thing's a hallucination brought on by the mixture of GB40 and the whatever she called it, the Ganymedian was fur or whatever. His brain felt dead, cold, and dry of animation. His spirit had completely frozen over, and all he could think of was getting out of the building, getting out of Santa Monica, and back up to Northern California and his own Connaught. Had London been right? He couldn't tell. Perhaps it was just what the girl had said. The pages he had sent to Bunny had been terrible, and that was all there was to it. But on the other hand, I've got to get in touch with Bunny, he realized. Right now, in fact. I should have called him back there from the apt. On the ground level floor of the Connaught building, he found a pay vidphone booth. Inside it, he began dialing the number of the Hintman organization, and then, all at once, he put the receiver back on its hook. Do I want to know? He asked himself. Can I stand knowing? He left the vidphone booth, stood momentarily, and then passed out through the main doors of the building onto the early evening street. At least I should wait until my wits are clear, he thought, until the drink has worn off, that non-tea intoxicant she gave me. Hands in his pockets, he began to walk aimlessly down the sidewalk runnel, and each minute feeling more and more scared and desperate. Everything was falling apart around him, and he seemed helpless to halt the collapse. He could only witness it, completely impotent, snatched up and gripped by processes too powerful for him to understand. A voice in his ear, female and recorded, was repeating, "That will be 1/4 skin, sir. Please deposit in coins, no bills." Blinking, he looked around him, discovered that he was once again in a vidphone booth. But whom was he calling? Bunny Hintman. Rummaging in his pockets, he found the 1/4 skin, dropped it in the slot of the pay vidphone. At once the image cleared. It was not Bunny Hintman that he was calling. On the screen, facing him, was the miniature image of Joan Triest. "What's the matter?" Joan said perceptively. "You look awful. Chuck, are you sick? Where are you phoning from?" "I'm in Santa Monica," he said. At least he assumed he still was. He had no memory of a ride back up to the Bay Area, and did not feel much later, or did it? He examined his wristwatch. 2 hours had passed. It was now after 8 o'clock. "I can't believe it," he said, "but this morning I was suspended by the CIA as a security risk, and now—" "Good grief," Joan said, listening intently. He grated. "Evidently I've been fired by Bunny Hintman, but I can't be sure, because frankly I'm afraid to get in touch with him." There was silence, and then Joan said calmly, "You must call him, Chuck, or I can do it for you. I'll tell him I'm your secretary or something. I can handle it, don't worry. Give me the number of the phone booth you're in, and don't give way to depression. I know you well enough already to know that you're going back to considering suicide, and if you try it in Santa Monica, I can't help you. I couldn't get to you in time." "Thanks," he said. "It's nice to hear someone cares. You've just had too much disruption in your life lately," Joan said in her intelligent, common-sense way. "The breakup of your marriage now—" "Call him," Chuck interrupted. "Here's the number." He held the slip of paper to the vid screen, and Joan wrote it down. After he had hung up, he stood in the phone booth. smoking and meditating. His brain was beginning to clear now, and he wondered what he had done between the hours of 6 and 8. His legs felt stiff, aching with fatigue. Perhaps he had been walking up and down the streets of Santa Monica, with no destination, no plans. Reaching into his coat pocket, he got out the tin of GB40 capsules, which he had brought along. Without benefit of water, he managed to swallow one. That would, he presumed, take away the fatigue effects, but nothing short of a frontal lobe retirement would take away the realization of the disaster which his situation had become. The slime mold, he thought, maybe it can help me. From Marin County Info he obtained Lord Running Clam's vidphone number. At once he placed the call, deposited the coins, waited as the phone rang, and the screen remained blank. Hello, words, not auditory but visual, greeted him, manifesting themselves on the screen. The slime mold, unable to talk, could not make use of the audio circuit. "This is Chuck Rittersdorf," he said. More words. "You are in trouble. I can't read your mind over such a distance." "Of course, but I catch the nuance in your voice. Do you have influence with Hintman?" Chuck asked. "As I informed you earlier, the words, 'a narrow band,' passed in sequence by the video scanner. I do not even know the man," Chuck said. "Evidently he's fired me. I'd like you to try to talk him into taking me back." God, he thought, I've to have some kind of a job. It was you, he said, who induced me to sign the contract with him. There's a lot of responsibility that can be laid to your door. Your job with the CIA, suspended because of my association with Hintman. Brutally, Chuck said, "Hintman knows too many non-Terrans." I see the words formed. Your highly neurotic security agency. I should have expected it, but I did not. You should have, since you are an employee of several years. Look, Chuck said, I didn't call to engage in a dispute as to who's to blame. I want a job, any job. I've got to have it tonight, he said to himself. I can't wait. I must ponder this, the slime mold informed him, via the moving strip of words. Give me. Chuck savagely hung up the phone. Again he stood closed up within the booth, smoking and waiting, wondering what Joan would say when she called back. Maybe, he thought, she won't call back. Especially if the news is bad. What a mess. What a state I've single-handedly. The phone rang. Lifting the receiver, he said, "Joan." On the screen, her small image formed. "I called the number you gave me, Chuck. I got someone on his staff, a Mr. Feld." Everything was in a state of agitation. All Feld would say was for me to look at the evening homeopape. "Okay," Chuck said, and felt even colder than before. "Thanks. I'll get a LA pape down here, and maybe I'll see you later." He broke the connection, hurriedly left the booth, walked outdoors to the sidewalk, and began searching for a peripatetic pape vendor. It took him only moments to get his hands on the evening pape. In the light of a store window, he stood reading. There it was on page 1. Of course it would be. Hintman was the top TV clown. Bunny Hintman arrested by CIA as agent of non-Terran power, flees captors in running laser battle. He had to read the article twice before he could believe it. What had happened was this: the CIA had, through its network of data collecting mechanisms, learned during the course of the day that the Hentman organization was dropping Chuck Rittersdorf. This, to the CIA minds, had proved their thesis. Hentman was only interested in Chuck because of Operation 50 Minutes on Alpha 3M2. Hence, they reasoned, Hentman was, as they had long suspected, an agent of the Alphanes, and the CIA had acted at once because Hentman's own informant in CIA would, if they had dallied, tipped him off and permitted him to escape. It was all very simple and very terrible. His hands shook as he held the pape up to the light. And Hentman had got away, despite the CIA's swift action. Perhaps Hentman's own machinery had been efficient enough to warn him. He had been expecting the flying action squad of CIA men that had tried to close in on him at, as the article said, the TV network studios in New York. So now, where was Bunny Hentman? Probably on his way to the Alpha system. And where was Chuck Rittersdorf? On his way to nothing. Ahead of him lay only a bog-like emptiness, filled with no persons, no tasks, no reason for existence. Hentman might call Patty Weaver, the TV starlet, and tell her that the script was out, but he hadn't bothered to. The vidphone call from Hentman had come in the evening, after the aborted arrest. Therefore, Patty Weaver knew where Hentman was, or at least might know, but that was something to go on. By cab, he quickly made his way back to Patty Weaver's magnificent Connaught building. He paid the cab and hurried to the entrance, pressed the buzzer for her apt. "Who is it?" Her voice still was cool, impersonal, even more so. Chuck said, "This is Rittersdorf. I left part of my script in your apt. I don't see any pages." She did not sound convinced. "If you'll let me in, I think I can lay my hands right on them. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes." "Okay." The tall metal door clicked, swung open. Upstairs in her apt, Patty had released it. He ascended by elevator. The door to her apt was open, and he walked on in. In the living room, Patty greeted him with chilly indifference. She stood with her arms folded, gazing stonily out the window at the view of nighttime Los Angeles. "There are no pages of your goddamn script here," she informed him. "I don't know what." That call from Bunny, Chuck said. Where was he calling from? She eyed him, one eyebrow raised. "I don't remember." "Have you seen tonight's homeopape?" After a long pause, she shrugged. "Maybe." "Bunny called you after the CIA made their arrest attempt. You know it, and I know it." So she did not even bother to look at him. In all his life he had never been so glacially ignored, and yet it seemed to him that underneath the hardness of her manner she was frightened. After all, she was very young, hardly 20. He decided to take the chance on that. "Miss Weaver, I'm an agent of the CIA." He still had his CIA identification. Reaching into his coat, he now got it out, held it toward her. You're under arrest." Her eyes flew wide open in a startled reaction. She spun, stifling an exclamation of dismay, and he could see how radically her breathing had altered. The heavy, red pullover sweater rose and fell rapidly. "You really are a CIA agent?" she asked in a strangled voice. "I thought you were a TV scriptwriter. That's what Bunny said." "We've penetrated the Hintman organization. I posed as a TV scriptwriter. Come on." He took hold of Patricia Weaver by the arm. "Where are we going?" She tugged away, horrified. "To the LA CIA office, where you'll be booked." "For what?" "You know where Bunny Hintman is," he said. There was silence. "I don't," she said and sagged. "I really don't. When he called, I didn't know he'd been arrested, or whatever it was. He didn't say anything about that. It was only when I went out to dinner, after that you left, that I saw the pape headlines." She moved morosely toward the bedroom. "I'll get my coat and purse. And I'd like to put on a little lipstick, but I'm telling you the truth, honest I am." He followed after her. In the bedroom, she got her coat down from a hanger in the closet, then opened a dresser drawer for her purse. "How long do you think they'll keep me?" she asked as she rooted in her purse. "Oh," he answered, "not more than—" He broke off because Patty held a laser pistol pointed toward him. She had found it in her purse. "I don't believe you're a CIA agent," she said. "But I am," Chuck said. "Get out of here. I don't understand what you're trying to do, but Bunny gave me this and told me to use it when and if I had to." Her hand shook, but the laser pistol remained pointed at him. "Please go on," she said. "Get out of my apt. If you don't go, I'll kill you. Honestly, I will. I mean it." She looked terribly, terribly frightened. Turning, he walked out of the app, into the hall, down the hall to the elevator. It was still there, and he stepped inside it. A moment later, he was back downstairs, stepping out on to the dark sidewalk. Well, that was that. It had scarcely worked out as he intended. On the other hand, he reflected, stoically, he had lost nothing, except perhaps his dignity, and that, given time, would return. There was nothing to do now but return to Northern California. 15 minutes later he was in the air, heading home to his dreary Connaught in Marin County. All in all, his experience in LA had failed to be sanguine. When he arrived, he found the app's lights on and the heater on. Seated in a chair, listening to an early Haydn symphony on the FM, was Joan Triest. As soon as she saw him, she hopped to her feet. "Thank God," she said. "I was so worried about you." Bending, she picked up the San Francisco Chronicle. "You saw the pape by now. Where does this put you, Chuck? Does it mean the CIA is after you too, as a Hintman employee?" "I don't know," he said, shutting the door of the apt. As far as he could make out, the CIA was not after him, but it was something to ponder. Joan was right. Going into the kitchen, he put on the tea kettle for coffee. Missing at a time like this the autonomic coffee-making circuit of the stove. He had got Mary, got her, left with her, along with almost everything else. At the doorway, Joan appeared. "Chuck, I think you ought to call into CIA. Talk with someone you know there. Your former boss, okay." He said with bitterness, "You're so law-abiding. Always comply with the authorities, correct?" He did not tell her that in the hour of crisis, when everything was falling apart around him right and left, his impulse had been to seek out Bunny Hintman, not the CIA. "Please," Joan said, "and I've been conversing with Lord Running Clam, and he feels the same way. I was listening to news on the radio, and they said something about other employees of the Hintman machine being arrested. Just leave me alone." He got down the jar of instant coffee, his hands shaking. He put a large teaspoonful in a mug. "If you don't contact them," Joan stated, "then I can't do anything for you, so I think it would be best if I left." Chuck said, "What could you do for me anyhow? What have you done for me in the past? I'll bet I'm the first person you ever met who lost 2 jobs in one day. Then what are you going to do?" "I think," Chuck said, "I'll immigrate to Alpha." Specifically, he thought, to Alpha 3M2. Had he been able to find Hintman? "The CIA's right then," Joan said. Her eyes smoldered. "The Hintman machine is in the pay of a non-Terran power." "Lord," Chuck said with disgust, "the war's been over for years. I'm sick of this cloak, mitt, dagger rubbish. I've had enough to last me forever. If I want to immigrate, then let me immigrate." "What I should do," Joan said, without enthusiasm, "is arrest you. I'm armed." She displayed, for his benefit then, the incredibly tiny, but undoubtedly genuine, sidearm which she carried. "But I can't do it. I feel so sorry for you. How could you make such a mess of your life? And Lord R.C. tried so hard to—" "Blame him," Chuck said. "He only wanted to help. He could see you weren't taking responsibility." Her eyes flashed. "No wonder Mary divorced you." He groaned. "You just won't try," Joan said. "You've given up." "You—" She ceased and stared at him. He had heard it too. The thoughts of the Ganymedian, slime mold from across the hall. "Mr. Rittersdorf, a gentleman is passing along the hall in the direction of your apt. He is armed, and he intends to force you to accompany him. I can't tell who he is or what he wants, because he's got a grid of some sort installed as a brain box lining to shield him from telepaths. Therefore, he's either a military person or a member of the security or intelligence police or part of a criminal or traitorous organization. In any case, prepare yourself." To Joan, Chuck said, "Give me that little laser pistol." "No." She lifted it from her holster, turned it toward the door of the app. Her face was clear and fresh. Evidently, she had herself completely under control. "My God," Chuck said, "you're going to get killed." He knew it, foresaw it as fully as if he were a precog, reaching out, With lashing speed, he grasped the laser tube and yanked it from her. The tube got away from him. Both he and Joan surged toward it, groping. They collided, and with a gasp, Joan tumbled against the wall of the kitchen. Chuck's clutching fingers found the tube. He straightened up, holding it. Something struck his hand, and he experienced heat. He dropped the laser tube, and it clattered away. At the same time, a man's voice, unfamiliar to him, rang in his ears. "Rittersdorf, I'll kill her if you try to pick that tube up." Again, the man, now in the living room, shut the apt door after him and came a few steps toward the kitchen, his own laser beam held in Joan's direction. He was middle-aged, wearing a cheap gray overcoat of domestic material and odd, archaic boots. The impression that flashed over Chuck was that the man hailed from some totally alien ecology, perhaps from another planet entirely. "I think he's from Hintman," Joan said as she slowly rose to her feet. "So he probably would do it, but if you think you could get hold of the tube before—" "No," Chuck said at once. "We'd both be dead." He faced the man. Then, "I tried to reach Hintman earlier." "Okay," the man said, and gestured toward the door. "The lady may stay here. I only want you, Mr. Rittersdorf. Come along, and let's not fnop any time. We have a long trip." "You can check with Patty Weaver," Chuck said as he walked ahead of the middle-aged man out of the hall. Behind him, the man grunted. "No more talking, Mr. Rittersdorf. There's been too much glucking talk already." "Such as what?" He halted, feeling ominous gradations of fear. "Such as your entering the organization as a CIA spy. We realize now why you wanted that job as TV script writer. It was to get evidence on Bunn. So what evidence did you get? You saw an Alphane. Is that a crime?" "No," Chuck said. "They're going to pelt him to death for that," the man with the gun said. "Hell, they've known for years that Bunn lived in the Alpha system. The war's over. Sure, he's got economic connections with Alpha. Who that's in business hasn't? But he's a big figure nationally. The public knows him. I'll tell you what got the CIA where they decided to crack down on him. It was Bunn's idea for a script about a CIA sim killing someone. The CIA figured he was beginning to use his TV show, too. Ahead in the hall, the Ganymedian slime mold, in a huge yellow heap, manifested itself, blocking the way. It had flowed out of its conapt. "Let us by," the man with the gun said. "I am sorry," Lord Running Clam's thoughts came to Chuck, "but I am a colleague of Mr. Rittersdorf's, and it is impractical for me to allow him to be carted off." The laser beam clacked on. Red and thin, it traveled by Chuck and disappeared into the center of the slime mold. With a crackling, tearing noise, the slime mold shriveled up, dried into a black, encrusted blob, which smoked and sputtered, charring the wooden floor of the hallway. "Move," the man with the gun said to Chuck. "He's dead," Chuck said. He couldn't believe it. "There's some more of them," the man said, "on Ganymede." His fleshy face showed no emotion, only alertness. "When we get into the elevator, press the up button. My ship's on the roof, and what a loused up little field it is." Numbly, Chuck entered the elevator. The man with the gun followed, and an instant later they had reached the roof. They stepped out into the cold of a foggy night. "Tell me your name," Chuck said. "Just your name." "Why, so I can find you again, for killing Lord Running Clam." Sometime sooner or later he would be set down in the same vector with this person. "I'll be glad to tell you my name," the man said as he herded Chuck into the parked hopper. Its landing lights glowed, and its turbine buzzed faintly. "Alf Sherigan," he said, as he stationed himself at the controls. Chuck nodded. "You like my name. You find it pleasant." Saying nothing, Chuck stared ahead. "You've stopped talking," Sherigan observed. "Too bad, because you and I'll be cooped up together until we reach Luna and Brahi City." He reached his snap on the auto course finding pilot. Beneath them the hopper bucked and leaped but did not ascend. "Wait here," Sheridan said, with a wave of his laser pistol in Chuck's direction. "Don't touch any of the controls." Opening the hatch of the hopper, he irritably put his head out, peering to see in the darkness what had stalled the lift action. "Holy critter," he said, "the outside conduit to the rear rubes." His speech stopped. He rapidly yanked himself back into the hopper once again, then fired with his laser beam. From the darkness of the roof, an answering beam paralleled his own, found its way through the open hatch, and to him. Sheridan dropped his weapon and flopped convulsively against the hull of the cabin, then twisted and sagged like a gored animal, his mouth hanging, his eyes corrupted and vague. Bending, Chuck picked up the discarded laser beam, looked out to see who it was. There, in the darkness, it was Joan. She had followed him and Sheridan up the hall, had taken the manual emergency lift to the roof field, and arrived behind them. He got hesitantly from the hopper and greeted her. Sheridan had made a mistake. He had not been informed that Joan was an armed policewoman and accustomed to emergencies. It was even hard for Chuck to realize what she had done so quickly. First, with one shot at the guidance system of the hopper, then the second shot, which had killed Alf Sheridan. "Are you getting out?" Joan asked. "I didn't hit you, did I?" "I'm untouched," Chuck said. "Listen." She approached the hatch of the hopper, regarded the slumped, discarded shape that had just now been Alf Sheridan. "I can bring him back, remember. Do you want me to, Chuck?" He considered a moment. He remembered Lord Running Clam, and because of that he shook his head no. "It's up to you," Joan said. "I'll let him stay dead. I don't like to, but I understand." "How about Lord?" "Chuck, I can't do anything for him. It's too late. More than 5 minutes has passed." I had the choice of staying there with him or following you and trying to assist you. I think it would have been better if you—" "No," Joan said firmly. "I did the right thing. You'll see." "Why, do you have a magnifying glass?" Startled, he said, "No, of course not. Look in the repair case of the hopper, in the storage region under the control panel. There's micro tools for fixing the miniaturized portions of the ship's circuits. You'll find a loop there." He opened the cabinet, rummaged about, mindlessly obeying her. A moment later his hands found the jeweler's loop. He stepped from the hopper holding it. "We'll go back below," Joan said, "to where he is." Presently the two of them bent over the reduced cinder, which had previously been their compatriot, the Ganymedian slime mold. "Stick the loop in your eye," Joan instructed, "and search around. Very closely, especially down in the pile of the carpet." "What for?" Joan said. "His spores." Taken aback, he said, "Did he have a chance to?" "Sporification for them is automatic. The moment they're attacked, it would have functioned instantaneously, I hope. They'll be microscopic, brown and round. You should be able to find them with the loop. It's of course impossible to with the naked eye. While you're doing that, I'll prepare a culture." She disappeared into Chuck's apt. He hesitated and then got down on his hands and knees to search the hall carpet for the spores of Lord Running Clam. When Joan returned, he had, in the palm of his hand, 7 tiny spheres. Under the lens they were smooth and brown and shiny, definitely spores, and he had located them near the spot where the waste remains of the slime mold lay. "They need soil," Joan said, as she watched him sprinkle the spores into the measuring cup which she had found in his kitchen, "and moisture and time. Find at least 20, because of course not all of them will survive." At last he managed to acquire from the dirty, much-used carpet 25 spores in all. These were transferred to the measuring cup, and then he and Joan descended to the lowest floor of the building, made their way out into the backyard. In the darkness they clutched handfuls of dirt, deposited the loose black soil into the measuring cup. Joan located a hose. She sprinkled drops of water onto the soil, and then sealed the cup off from the air with a polyfilm wrapper. On Ganymede, she explained, the atmosphere is warm and dense. This is the best I can do to simulate proper conditions for the spores, but I think it'll work. Lord R.C. told me once that in an emergency, Ganymedians have managed to sporify successfully in open-air conditions on Terra, so let's hope. With Chuck, she returned to the building, carrying the cup with great care. "How long will it take," he asked, "before we know?" "I'm not sure. As soon as 2 days. Or, and this has happened in some cases, depending on the phase of the moon, as long as a month," she explained. "It may sound like superstition, but the moon will affect the activation of these spores. So resign yourself to that. The fuller, the better. We can look it up in tonight's homeopate." They ascended to the floor of his app. "How much memory will there be in the new, he hesitated, is in the next generation of slime mold? Will it, or they remember us and what took place here? As she sat examining the homeopape, Joan said, "It depends entirely on how quickly he managed to act. If he got off spores from his," she shut the pape, "the spores should react in a matter of days." "What would happen," Chuck asked, "if I took them off Terra, away from Luna's influence?" "They'd still grow, but it might take longer. What's on your mind?" "If the Hintman organization would send someone to find me," Chuck said, "and something happened to him." "Oh yes, of course," Joan agreed. "They'll be sending another, probably in a few hours, as soon as they realize we got the first one. And he may have had a dead man's signal installed on him somewhere, so they had the information as soon as his heart stopped. I think you're right. You should get off Terra as soon as possible. But how, Chuck?" "To really disappear, you'd have to have resources, some money and support, and you don't. You have no source of income at all now. Do you have anything at all saved up?" "Mary got the joint account," he said. Pondering, he seated himself, lit a cigarette. "I have an idea," he said at last, "of what I'm going to try. I'd prefer you didn't hear. Do you understand? Or do I just sound neurotic and fearful?" "You just sound anxious, and you ought to be." She rose. "I'll go out into the hall. I know you want to place a call. While you're doing that, I'll contact the Ross Police Department and have them come here to dispose of that man in the hopper up above us." At the door of the apt, she lingered. "However, Chuck, I'm glad I was able to keep them from taking you. I barely made it. Where was the hopper going?" "I'd rather not tell you for your own protection." She nodded, and the door shut after her. Now he was alone. At once he placed a call to the San Francisco CIA office. It took some time, but at last he was able to trace down his former boss, Jack Elwood. At home with his family, Elwood answered the vidphone with irritation, nor was he pleased to see who it was. "I'll make a deal with you," Chuck said. "A deal we believe you directly or indirectly tipped off Hintman so that he had the opportunity to escape. Isn't that what happened? We even know whom you worked through. That starlet in Santa Monica, that's Hintman's current mistress." Elwood scowled. This was new to Chuck. He hadn't realized this about Patty Weaver. However, it hardly mattered now. "The deal," Chuck said, "that I intend to make with you, with the CIA, officially, is this. I know where Hintman is. That doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is that you're willing to tell us. Why is that, Chuck? A falling out within the Hintman happy family, with you on the outside. The Hintman organization has already sent one NERT out," Chuck said. "We were able to stop him, but there'll be another, and then another, until finally Hintman gets me." He did not bother to try to explain his difficult situation to Elwood. His former boss wouldn't believe him, and anyhow, his wants would remain the same. "I'll tell you where Hintman is hiding out," in exchange for a CIA C-plus ship, an inter-system ship, one of those small military-style pursuit-class vessels. I know you've got a few of them. You can spare one, and you're getting back something of enormous value," he added. "And I'll return the ship eventually. It's just the use of it that I want." "You actually do sound as if you're trying to get away," Elwood said with acuity. "I am." "Okay," Elwood shrugged. "I'll believe you, why not? And so what? Tell me where Hintman is. I'll have the ship for you within 5 hours. In other words, Chuck realized, they'll hold up delivery until they have had a chance to check my information. If Hintman isn't found, there will be no ship. I'll be waiting in vain." But it was hopeless to expect the pros of the CIA to operate in any other fashion. This was their business. Life for them was one great card game. Resignedly, he said, "Hintman is on Luna at Bra City." "Wait at your apt," Elwood said instantly. "The ship will be there by 2 this morning. If—" he eyed Chuck. Breaking the connection, Chuck went to pick up his burned-down cigarette from the edge of the living room coffee table. Well, if the ship did not show up, then this was the end. He had no other plans, no alternative solution. Joan Triest might save him again, might even bring him back after a nerd of Hintman's had actually killed him. But if he stayed on Terra, eventually they would find and destroy him, or at least capture him. Detection devices were simply too good now. Given sufficient time, they always found the target, if it were still somewhere on the planet. But Luna, unlike Terra, had uncharted areas. Detection there posed a problem, and there existed remote moons and planets where detection by anyone was a near impossibility. One of those areas was the Alpha system, for example Alpha 3, and its several moons, including M2, most especially M2, and with a CIA faster-than-light ship, he could reach it in a matter of days, as had Mary and the gang with her. Opening the door to the hall, he said to Joan, "Okay, I made my one puny call, that's that. Are you leaving Terra?" Her eyes were enormous and dark. "We'll see," he seated himself, prepared to wait it out. With great care, Joan set the measuring cup of Lord Runningclam's spores on the arm of the couch by Chuck. "I'll give these to you. I know you want them. It was you he gave his life for, and you feel responsible. Better let me tell you what to do as soon as the spores become active." He got pen and paper in order to write down her instructions. It was actually several hours later. The Ross Police Department had shown up and lugged off the dead man on the roof, and Joan Triest had departed. That he realized what he had done. Now Bunny Hintman was right. He had betrayed Hintman to the CIA, but he had done it to save his life. That, however, would hardly justify it in Hintman's eyes. He, too, was trying to save his life. In any case, it was done. He continued to wait, alone in his apt, for the C-plus ship from CIA, a ship which very likely was never going to arrive. And what then? Then he decided. I'll be sitting here and waiting for something else, for the next NERT from the Hintman organization, and my life can be measured out in teaspoonfuls. It was one hell of a long wait. Chapter 10. Bowing slightly, Gabriel Baines said, "We constitute the sine qua non council possessing over all authority on this world, an ultimate form of authority which can't be overruled by any one." He, with stark, cold politeness, drew back a chair for the Terran psychologist, Dr. Mary Rittersdorf. She accepted it with a brief smile. It seemed to him that she looked tired. The smile showed genuine gratitude. The other members of the council introduced themselves to Dr. Rittersdorf in their several idiosyncratic fashions. Howard Straw, Mans, Jacob Simeon. Simeon could not suppress his moronic grin. From the Hebes, where your ship set down. Annette Golding, Polly. Her eyes were alert, and she sat erectly, watchful of the female psychologist who had barged into their lives. Ingrid Hibbler, 123 Obcom. Dr. Rittersdorf said, "And that would be," she nodded. "Oh yes, of course, obsessive-compulsive. Omar Diamond. I will let you guess what clan I am from." Diamond glanced about remotely. He seemed withdrawn into his private world, much to Gabriel Baines' annoyance. This was scarcely a time for individual activity, even of a mystical order. This was the moment in which they had to function as a whole or not at all. In a hollow, despairing voice, the Depp said, "Dino Waters." He struggled to say more, then gave up. The weight of pessimism, of sheer hopelessness, was too great for him. Once more he sat staring down, rubbing his forehead in a miserable, tick-like motion. "And you know who I am, Dr. Rittersdorf," Baines said, and rattled the document which lay before him. It represented the joint efforts of the council members, their manifesto. "Thank you for coming here," he began, and cleared his throat. His voice had become husky with tension. "Thank you for allowing me to," Dr. Rittersdorf said, in a formal, but to him, distinctly menacing tone. Her eyes were opaque. Baines said, "You have asked to be permitted to visit settlements other than Gandhi Town. In particular, you requested permission to examine Da Vinci Heights. We have discussed this. We decided to decline." Nodding, Dr. Rittersdorf said, "I see. Tell her why." Howard Straw spoke up. His face was ugly. He had not for an instant taken his eyes from the lady psychologist from Terra. His hatred for her filled the room and tainted the atmosphere. Gabriel Baines felt as if he were choking in it. Raising her hand, Dr. Rittersdorf said, "Wait, before you read me your statement." She looked at each of them in turn. A slow, steady, and totally professional scrutiny. Howard Straw returned it with malignance. Jacob Simeon ducked his head, smiled emptily, letting her attention simply pass. Annette Golding nervously scratched at the cuticle of her thumbnail, her pale face. The Depp never noticed that he was under observation. He never once raised his head. The skit's Omar Diamond returned Miss Rittersdorf's stare with sweet sublimity, yet underneath it Baines guessed there was anxiety. Diamond looked as if at any moment he might bolt. As for himself, he found Dr. Mary Rittersdorf physically attractive, and he wondered idly if the fact that she had arrived without her husband signified anything. She was, in fact, sexy, as an inexplicable incongruity, considering the purpose of this meeting. Dr. Rittersdorf wore a distinctly feminine outfit, black sweater and skirt, no stockings, gilded slippers with turned-up elfish toes. The sweater, Baines observed, was just a fraction too tight. Did Miss Rittersdorf realize this? He could not tell, but in any case he found his attention drawn away from what she was saying to her well-articulated breasts. They were admittedly small but quite distinct as regard to angle. He liked them. He wondered if this woman she was, he surmised, in her early 30s, certainly in her physical nubile prime, if she is looking for something more than professional success here. He had a powerful, effective insight that Dr. Rittersdorf was animated by a personal spirit as well as a task-oriented one. Again, she perhaps was not conscious of this. The body, he reflected, possesses ways of its own, sometimes in contradistinction to the purposes of the mind. This morning, on arising, Dr. Rittersdorf might merely have thought that she would like to wear this black sweater without thinking any more about it, but the body, the well-formed gynecologic apparatus within, knew better. And to this an analogous portion of himself responded. However, in his case it was a conscious reaction, and he thought, perhaps this can be turned to our group's advantage. This dimension of involvement might not be the liability for us that it surely is for our antagonist. Thinking this, he felt himself slide into a posture of contrived defense. He had schemes, automatic and plentiful, by which to protect not only himself but also his colleagues. Dr. Rittersdorf, he said smoothly, before we could permit you to enter our several settlements, a delegation representing our clans would have to inspect your ship to see what armaments, if any, you have along with you. Anything else is unworthy of even cursory consideration. We are not armed, Dr. Rittersdorf said. Nevertheless, Gabriel Baines said, I propose to you that you allow me and perhaps one other individual here to accompany you to your base. I have a proclamation here, he rattled the manifesto, which calls for your ship to vacate Gandhi Town within 48 Terran hours. If you don't comply, he glanced at Straw, who nodded, we will initiate military operations against you on the grounds that you are hostile, uninvited invaders. In a low, modulated voice, Dr. Rittersdorf said, I understand your comprehension. You've lived here in isolation for quite a time. But she was speaking directly to him. Her fine, unintelligent eyes confronted him purposefully. "I'm afraid I have to call attention to a fact which you all may find distasteful. You are, individually and collectively, mentally ill." There was a taut, prolonged silence. "Hell," Straw said to no one in particular. "We blew that place sky high years ago, that so-called hospital, which was really a concentration camp." His lips twisted. "For purposes of slave labor." "I am sorry to say it," Dr. Rittersdorf said, "but you are wrong. It was a legitimate hospital, and you must include the realization of this as a factor in any plans you might make regarding us. I'm not lying to you. I'm speaking the plain simple truth." "Quid est veritas?" Baines murmured. "Pardon," Dr. Rittersdorf said. Baines said, "What is truth? Hasn't it occurred to you, Doctor, that in the last decade we here might have risen above our initial problems of group adaptation and become," he gestured, "adjusted, or whatever term you prefer, in any case capable of possessing adequate interpersonal relationships, such as you're witnessing here in this chamber? Surely, if we can work together, we are not sick. There's no other test you can apply except that of group workability." He sat back, pleased with himself. "With care," Dr. Rittersdorf said, "you are admittedly unified against a common enemy, against us. But I'd be willing to place a bet that before we arrived, and again after we depart, you will fragment into isolated individuals, mistrustful and frightened of one another, unable to collaborate." She smiled disarmingly, but it was far too wise a smile for him to accept. It too much underscored her very clever statement, because of course she was right. She had put her finger on it. They did not function together regularly. But she was also wrong. This was her error. She supposed, probably as a matter of self-justifying protection, that the origin of the fear and hostility lay with the council, but in fact it was Terra who displayed menacing tactics. The landing of their ship was de facto a hostile act. Were it not, an attempt would have been made to secure permission. These Terrans themselves had manifested initial distrust. They alone were responsible for the present pattern of mutual suspicion. Had they wanted to, they could readily have avoided it. "Dr. Rittersdorf," he said bluntly, "the Alphane traders contact us when they want permission to land. We notice that you did not, and we have no problem in our dealings with them. We trade back and forth on a regular, constant basis." Obviously, his gauntlet had been thrown down to good effect. The woman hesitated, did not have an answer. While she pondered, everyone in the room rustled with amusement, contempt, and, as in the case of Howard Straw, pitiless animosity. "We assumed," Dr. Rittersdorf said at last, "that had we formally requested permission to land, you would have refused us." Smiling, feeling calm, Baines said, "But you didn't try, you assumed, and now of course you'll never know, because—" "Would you have granted us permission?" Her voice snapped at him, firm and authoritative, penetrating and shattering the continuity of his utterance. He blinked, involuntarily paused. "No, you wouldn't have," she continued, "and all of you know it. Please try to be realistic." If you show up at Da Vinci Heights, Howard Straw said, we'll kill you. In fact, if you don't leave, we'll kill you. And the next ship that tries to land will never touch ground. This is our world, and we plan to retain it as long as we survive. Mr. Baines here can recite the details of your original imprisonment of us. It's all contained in the manifesto which he and I, with the help of the others in this room, prepared. Read the manifesto, Mr. Baines. 25 years ago, Gabriel Baines began. A colony was established on this planet. Dr. Rittersdorf sighed. Our knowledge of the assorted patterns of your mental illnesses. Sorted. Howard Straw burst in. Did you say sorted? His face was mottled with dire rage. He half rose from his chair. I said assorted, Dr. Rittersdorf said patiently. Our knowledge informs us that the focus of your militant activity will be found in the man's settlement. In other words, the manic group's settlement. 4 hours from now, we will break camp and leave the hebephrenic settlement of Gandhi-town. We will set down in Da Vinci Heights, and if you engage us in combat, we'll bring in line-class Terran military forces, she added, which are standing by approximately half an hour from here. Again, there was a taut and prolonged silence in the room. Annette Goulding at last spoke up, but barely audibly. Read our manifesto anyhow, Gabriel. Nodding, he resumed, but his voice shook. Annette Goulding began to cry, miserably, interrupting his reading. You can see what's in store for us. They're going to turn us back into hospital patients again. It's the end. Uncomfortably, Dr. Rittersdorf said, we're going to provide therapy for you. It'll cause you to feel more well, relaxed with one another, more yourselves. Life will take on a more pleasant, natural significance. As it is, you're all oppressed with such strain and fears. Yes, Jacob Simeon muttered, fears that Tara will break in here and round us up, like a lot of animals again. 4 hours, Gabriel Baines thought. Not long. His voice trembling, he resumed the reading of their joint manifesto. It seemed to him an empty gesture, because there is just exactly nothing, he realized, that is going to save us. After meeting had ended, and Dr. Rittersdorf had departed, Gabriel Baines laid his plan before his colleagues. You're what? Howard Straw demanded with contemptuous derision, his face made into a parody of itself by his grimace. You say you're going to seduce her. My God, maybe she's right. Maybe we ought to be in a neuropsychiatric hospital. He sat back and wheezed bleakly to himself. His disgust was too great. He could make no further motions of abuse. He left that to the others in the room. You must think a lot of yourself, Annette Goulding said. Finally, what I need, Gabriel said, is someone with enough telepathic ability to tell me if I'm right. He turned to Jacob Simeon. Doesn't that Hebe saint, that Ignaz Ledbetter, have at least a little capacity for telepathy? He's sort of a jack-of-all-trades, talent-wise. None that I know of, Simeon said, but you just might try Sarah Apostles. He winked at Gabrielle, shaking his head in mirth. I'll phone Gandhi-town, Gabriel Baines said, picking up the phone. Simeon said, the phone lines in Gandhi-town are out again, for 6 days now. You'll have to go there. You'd have to go there anyhow, Dino Waters said, rousing himself at last from the slumber of his endless depression. He alone seemed somewhat taken by Baines' scheme. After all, that's where he is, in Gandhi-town, where anything goes. Everyone has children by everyone. By now she may, in the spirit of the thing. With a grunt of agreement, Howard Straw said, It's luck for you, Gabe, that she's among the Hebes. She ought to be more receptive to you because of that. If this is the only way we can comport ourselves, Miss Hibbler said stiffly, I think we deserve to perish. I truly do. The universe, Omar Diamond pointed out, possesses an infinitude of ways by which it fulfills itself. Even this must not out of hand be despised. He nodded gravely. Without another word, without even saying goodbye to Annette, Gabriel Baines strode from the council chamber, down the wide stone stairs and out of the building, to the parking lot. There he boarded his turbine-driven auto, and presently, at a meager 75 miles an hour, was on his way to Gandhi-town. He would arrive before the 4-hour deadline he calculated, assuming that nothing had fallen onto the road blocking it. Dr. Rittersdorf had returned to Gandhi-town by rocket-driven launch. She was already there. He cursed at the archaic mode of transportation which he had to rely on, but there it was. This was their world, and the reality for which they were fighting as a satellite of the Terran culture. Once more they would regain modern means of transportation, but this is in no way would make up for what they stood to lose. Better to travel at 75 miles an hour and be free. Ah, he thought, a slogan. And yet it was a trifle annoying, considering the vitalness of his mission, council-sanctioned or not. 4 hours and 20 minutes later, physically wearied by his travel but mentally alert, even keyed up, he reached the rubbish-strewn outskirts of Gandhi-town. He smelled the odor of the settlement, the sweet smell of rot mixed with the acrid stench of countless small fires. During the trip he had evolved a new idea, so at this last moment he turned, not toward Sarah Apostle's shack, but toward that of the Hebe St. Ignatz Ledbetter. He found Ledbetter tinkering with an ancient rusty gasoline generator in his yard, surrounded by his children and cats. I have seen your plan, Ledbetter said, raising a hand to stop Gabriel from breaking into an explanation. It was traced in blood on the horizon just a short while ago. Then you know specifically what I want from you. Yes, Ledbetter nodded. And in the past, with a number of women, I have made successful use of it. He put down the hammer which he held, strolled toward the shack. The cats, but not the children, followed. So did Gabriel Baines. However, it is a microscopic idea that you possess, Ledbetter said reprovingly, and chuckled. Can you read the future? Can you tell me if I'll succeed? I am no seer. Others may foretell, but I remain silent. Wait a minute. Within the one main room of the shack, he paused while the cats trotted and hopped and meowed. on all sides. Then he reached above the sink, lifted down a quart jar with a dark substance inside. He unscrewed the lid of the jar, sniffed, shook his head, put the lid back on the jar, and restored it to its place. Not that, he wandered off, then finally opened the ice box, rummaged within, came out with a plastic carton, which he inspected with a critical frown. His present common-law wife, Gabriel Baines, did not know her name, appeared from the bedroom, glanced dully at the two of them, then started on. She wore a sack-like dress, tennis shoes, and no socks, her hair a mass of uncombed, dirty material coating the top and back of her head. Gabriel Baines looked away in gloomy disgust. "Say," Ledbetter said to the woman, "where's that jar of you-know-what? That mixture we used before he gestured. In the bathroom." The woman padded on by, going outdoors. Disappearing into the bathroom, Ledbetter could be heard moving objects about, glasses and bottles. At last he returned, carrying a tumbler filled with a liquid that slopped against the sides as he walked. "This is it," Ledbetter said, with a grin that showed two missing teeth, "but you have to induce her to take it. How are you going to manage that?" At that moment Gabriel Baines did not know. "We'll see," he said, and held out his hand for the aphrodisiac. After leaving Ledbetter, he drove to the single shopping center in Gandhi Town, parked before the dome-shaped wooden structure with its peeling paint, its stacks of dented cans, heaps of discarded cardboard cartons littering the entrance and parking area. Here the Alphane traders rid themselves, dumped actually great masses of seconds. Within, he bought a bottle of Alf brandy. Seated in his auto, he opened it, poured out a portion of the contents, added the dingy, heavily sedimented aphrodisiac, which the Hebe saint had given him. The two liquids managed somehow to mix. Satisfied, he recapped the bottle, started up the car, and drove on. This was, he reflected, no time for him to depend on his natural talents. As the council had pointed out, he did not particularly excel in this direction, and excellence, if they wished to survive, was mandatory. Visually, he managed without difficulty to locate the Terran ship. It loomed high and shiny and metallic-y clean above the litter of Gandhi Town, and as soon as he sighted it, he turned his auto in that direction. An armed Terran guard wearing a gray-green uniform, familiar from the late war, halted him a few hundred yards from the ship, and from a nearby doorway Baines saw the muzzle of a heavy weapon trained on him. "Your identi papers, please," the guard said, wearily scrutinizing him. Gabriel Baines said, "Tell Dr. Rittersdorf that a plenipotentiary from the Supreme Council is here to make a final offer by which bloodshed on both sides can be avoided." He sat tautly bolt upright behind the tiller of his car, gazing straight ahead. By intercom, the arrangements were made. "You may go ahead, sir." Another Terran, also in full military dress, with sidearms and decorations, conducted him on foot to the ramp that led up to the open hatch of the ship. They ascended, and presently he was bumping his way morosely down a corridor, searching for room 32H. The confining walls made him uneasy. He longed to be back outdoors where he could breathe, but too late now. He found the proper door, hesitated, then knocked. Under his arm the bottle gurgled slightly. The door swung open, and there stood Dr. Rittersdorf, still wearing the slightly too tight black sweater, the black skirt, and elfish shoes. She regarded him uncertainly. "Let's see, you're Mr. Baines." "Ah, the pair." Half to herself she added, "Schizophrenic paranoia." "Oh, I beg your pardon," she flushed. "No offense meant." "I'm here," Gabriel Baines said, "to drink a toast. Will you join me?" He walked past her into her diminutive quarters. A toast to what? He shrugged. That ought to be obvious. He allowed just the right shade of irritation to enter his voice. "Are you giving in?" Her tone was sharp, penetrating. Closing the door, she came a step toward him. "2 glasses," he said, in a deliberately resigned, muted voice. "Okay, doctor." He got the bottle of Alphane brandy and its alien additive from its paper bag, began to unscrew the cap. "I think you're definitely doing the wise thing," Dr. Rittersdorf said. She looked distinctly pretty as she scurried about searching for glasses. Her eyes shone. "This is a good sign, Mr. Baines, really." Somberly, still the incarnation of defeat, Gabriel Baines poured from the bottle until both glasses were full. "We can land, then, at Da Vinci Heights?" Dr. Rittersdorf asked, as she lifted her glass and sipped. "Oh, sure," he agreed, listlessly. He, too, sipped. It tasted awful. "I'll inform the security member of our mission," she said. "Mr. Majboom, so no accidental." She all at once became silent. "What's wrong?" "I just had the strangest—" Dr. Rittersdorf frowned. "A sort of flutter deep inside me. If I didn't know better." She looked embarrassed. "Never mind, Mr. Is it Baines?" Rapidly she drank from her glass. "I feel so tense all of a sudden. I guess I was worried. We didn't want to see—" Her voice trailed away. Walking to the corner of the compartment, she seated herself on the chair there. "You put something in that drink." Rising, she let the glass drop. She crossed as swiftly as possible toward a red button on the far wall. As she passed him, he caught her around the waist. The plenipotentiary from the Interclan Council of Alpha 3M2 had made his move. For better or worse, the plan was being enacted, their struggle to survive. Dr. Rittersdorf bit him on the ear, nearly severing the lobe. "Hey," he said feebly. Then he said, "What are you doing?" After that he said, "Lediber's concoction really works." He added, "But I mean, there's a limit to everything." Time passed, and he said gaspingly, "At least, there should be." A knock sounded on the door. Raising herself up slightly, Dr. Rittersdorf called, "Go away." "It's Majboom," a muffled male voice sounded from the corridor. Springing to her feet, disentangling herself from him, Dr. Rittersdorf ran to the door and locked it. At once she spun and with a ferocious expression dived. It looked to him as if she were diving directly at him. He shut his eyes and prepared for the impact. But was this going to get them what they wanted politically? Holding her down, keeping her to one spot on the floor, a little to the right of the heap of her tossed-away clothing, Baines grunted, "Listen, Dr. Rittersdorf, Mary," and this time she bit him on the mouth. Her teeth clinked against him with stunning force, and he winced with pain, shut his eyes involuntarily. That turned out to be his cardinal mistake, because in that moment he was tilted. The next he knew, he was somehow on the bottom, pinned in place. Her sharp knees dug into his loins, and she grasped him just above the ears, gathering his hair between her fingers and tugging upward as if to pull his head from his shoulders, and at the same time he managed to call out weakly, "Help!" The person on the other side of the door, however, had evidently already departed. There was no response. Baines made out the sight of the red button on the wall, which Mary Rittersdorf had been about to press, had intended to, but now, beyond any doubt whatsoever, would never in a million years press, and began to squirm inch by inch in its direction. He never made it. And the thing that gets me, he thought later on in despair, is that in addition this is getting the council nowhere politically. Dr. Rittersdorf, he grated, wheezing for breath, "Let's be reasonable. For God's sake, let's talk, okay? Please." This time she bit the top of his nose. He felt her sharp teeth meet. She laughed. It was a long, echoing laugh that chilled him. "I think that what's going to kill me," he decided finally, after the passage of what seemed an unending amount of time, in which neither of them managed to say any more, "is the biting. I'm being bitten to death, and there is nothing I can do." He felt as if he had stirred up and encountered the libido of the universe. It was a mere elemental but enormous power that had him pinned to the rug, here with no possibility of escape. If only someone would break in, one of the armed guards, for instance. "Did you know," Mary Rittersdorf whispered wetly against his cheek, "that you're the prettiest man alive?" At that she backed off slightly, sitting on her haunches, adjusting herself. He saw his opportunity and rolled away, scrambling. He broke for the button, groped frantically to press it, to summon someone, anyone, Terran or not. Panting, she seized him by the ankle, brought him crashing down. His head hit the side of a metal cabinet, and he moaned as the darkness of defeat and annihilation, of a sort he had never been prepared for by anything previous in his life, seeped over him. With a laugh, Mary Rittersdorf rolled him about and once more pounced on him. Her bare knees again dug into him, her breast dangling above his face as she clamped her hands over his wrists and bore him flat. It obviously did not matter to her whether he was conscious really. He discovered, as the darkness became complete, one last thought entered his mind, a final determination. Somehow, some way, he would get the Hebe St. Ignaz Litteber for this, if it was his last act in life. "Oh, you're so lovely," Mary Rittersdorf's voice, uttered within a quarter inch of his left ear, rang, deafening him. "I could just eat you up." She quivered from head to foot, an undulation that was like a storm of mobility, a tossing of the surface of the earth itself. He had, as he passed out, a terrible feeling that Dr. Rittersdorf had just begun, and Litteber's concoction did not account for this, because it had not affected him this way. Gabriel Baines and the Hebe Saints' concoction had provided an opportunity for something already in Dr. Mary Rittersdorf to emerge, and he would be lucky if the combination did not turn out to be, as it seemingly was turning out to be, not a so-called love potion, but a clear-cut potion of death. At no time did he truly lose consciousness, therefore he was aware that much later the activity in which he was caught began by degrees to abate, the artificially induced whirlwind diminished, and then at last there was a fitful peace, and then by an agency which remained obscure to him, he was physically moved from his place on the floor, from Dr. Mary Rittersdorf's compartment, to some other place entirely. "I wish I was dead," he said to himself. Obviously, the last of the grace period had trickled away. The Terran ultimatum had expired, and he had failed to halt events. And where was he? Cautiously Baines opened his eyes. It was dark. He lay outdoors, under the stars. Amid and around him rose the junk heap, which was the Hebe settlement of Gandhi-town. In no direction he peered frantically could he make out the shape of the Terran ship. So obviously it had taken off to land at Da Vinci Heights. Shivering, he sat weakly up. Where, in the name of all that was sacred to the species, were his clothes? Hadn't she cared enough to give them back? It seemed a gratuitous coda. He lay back and shut his eyes, and cursed to himself in a sing-song voice, and he, the pair delegate to this Supreme Council. Too much, he thought bitterly. A noise to his right attracted him. Again he opened his eyes, this time peering shrewdly. An antique vehicle of some obsolete sort putt-putted toward him. He made out, now, bushes. Yes, he realized, he had been tossed in the bushes too, fulfilling the ancient saw. Mary Rittersdorf had reduced him to the status of a participant in a folk sang. He hated her for that, but his fear of her, much greater, did not budge. What was coming was nothing more than a typical Hebe internal combustion engine car. He could distinguish its yellow headlights. Climbing to his feet, he waved the car to a halt, standing in the center of the nebulous, Hebe-built cowpath, here on the outskirts of Gandhi-town. "What's the matter?" the Hebe driver, in his drawly jejune voice, inquired. He was so deteriorated as to be devoid of caution. Baines walked up to the door of the car and said, "I was attacked." "Oh, too bad. Took your clothes too. Get in." The Hebe banged on the door behind him until it swung creakingly open. "I'll drive you to my place. Get you something to wear," Baines said grimly. "I'd prefer it if you took me to Ignaz Lederber's shack. I want to talk to him." But if it had all been there, buried inside the woman in the first place, how could he blame the Hebe saint? No one could have predicted it, and surely if it generally affected women this way, Lederber would have ceased to employ it. "Who's that?" the Hebe driver inquired as he started up the car. There was little intercommunication in Gandhi-town. It was a symptom. Baines realized that rather bore out Mary Rittersdorf's statements about the mall. However, he drew himself together and described as best he could the location of the Hebe saint's shack. "Oh yeah," the driver said. "The guy who has all those cats. I ran over one the other day," he chuckled. Baines shut his eyes, groaned. Presently they had halted before the dimly lit shack of the Hebe saint. The driver banged open the car door. Baines climbed stiffly out, aching in every joint, and still suffering unbearably from the 1,000,001 bites which Mary Rittersdorf, in her passion, had inflicted. He made his way step by step across the littered yard. In the uneven yellow light of the car's headlights, found the shack's door, nudged an undetermined collection of cats from his way, and rapped on the door. Seeing him, Ignaz Litteber rocked with laughter. "What a time it must have been! You're bleeding all over. I'll get you something to wear, and Elsie'll probably have something for those bites, or whatever they are. It looks as if she worked you over with a pair of cuticle scissors." Chuckling, he shuffled off somewhere in the rear of the shack. A horde of grimy children regarded Baines as he stood by the oil heater, warming himself. He ignored them. Later, as Litteber's common-law wife dabbed ointment on the bites, which constellated around his nose, mouth, and ears, and Litteber laid out tattered but reasonably clean clothes, Gabriel Baines said, "I've got her figured out. Obviously, she's the oral sadistic type. That's where things went wrong. Mary Rittersdorf," he realized soberly, was as sick as, or even more than anyone on Alpha 3M2, but it had been latent. Litteber said the Terran ship took off. "I know," he began, "now to dress." "There has been a vision," Litteber said, "that has reached me in the last hour about the arrival of another Terran ship. A warship, Baines guessed, to take Da Vinci Heights. He wondered if they'd go as far as to H-bomb the Manses settlement in the name of psychotherapy. This is a tiny, fast pursuit ship," Litteber said, "according to my psychic presentation, related by the primordial forces like a bee. It hurtled down, landed near the Poly settlement. Hamlet. At once Baines thought of Annette Golding. He hoped to heaven that she was all right. "Do you have any kind of vehicle, anything I can ride back to Adolfville in?" There was his own car, presumably parked at the spot the Terran ship had occupied. Hell, he could walk to it from here, and he would not drive to his own settlement. He decided he would go to Hamlet, make certain that Annette had not been raped, beaten up, or lasered. If she were harmed in any way. "I let them down," he said to Litteber. "I claimed I had a plan. They depended on me, naturally because I'm a pair." But he had not given up yet. His pair mind was filled with schemes, active and alive. He would go to his grave this way, still planning how to defeat the enemy. "You should eat something," Litteber's woman suggested, "before you go anywhere. There's some kidney stew left. I intended to give it to the cats, but you're welcome to it." "Thanks," he said, managing not to gag. Hebe cooking left something to be desired, but she was right. He needed to regain a certain amount of energy. Otherwise, he'd fall dead in his tracks. It was amazing he had not already considering what had befallen him. After he had eaten, he borrowed a flashlight from Litteber, thanked him for the clothes, ointment, and meal, then set off on foot through the narrow, twisted, junk-filled streets of Gandhitown. Fortunately, his car was still where he had left it. Neither Hebes or Terrans had seen fit to cart it off, saw it up, or pulverize it. Getting in, he drove from Gandhitown, took the road east toward Hamlet. Once more, at a pitiful 75 miles an hour, he was on his way across the open, exposed landscape between settlements. With him rode a dreadful sense of urgency, of a sort he had never before experienced. Da Vinci Heights had been invaded, perhaps already had fallen. What was left? How without the fantastic energy of the man's clan could they survive? If perhaps the single small Terran ship meant something, might not that be a hope? At least it was unexpected, and within the realm of the expected they had no chance, were doomed. He was not a Skitz or a Hebe, and yet, in his own dim way, he had his visions too. It was a vision of the off chance, the one possibility plucked from the many. His first plan had fallen through, but there was still this. He believed in this, and he did not even know why.